Hello and welcome to Japan Expert Insights and our discussion series on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Every second Monday, Dr. Stephen Nagy, Senior Associate Professor at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the International Christian University in Tokyo, and host Maya Matsuoka host a discussion on the latest developments, new challenges, and shifts in the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific region. In this podcast, we welcome comments, questions, and opinions, so if you haven't done so yet, join us next time. In the meantime, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload audio episodes on the Japanese politics, business insights, and the Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region. Good evening to everybody. Welcome. Today, once again, we've got Professor Stephen Nagy, who you know from our previous rooms, a series of geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. So Professor Nagy is a Senior Associate Professor at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the International Christian University in Tokyo. And today the discussion is about the Koreas and the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific. As usual, Professor Nagy is going to walk us through the main points, and then he's going to open the floor for discussion. Stephen, we can start now.
Thanks very much, Maya, and thank you very much to everybody in the room and who will be joining later. Tonight's theme is the Koreas and the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific. And, over the past 6 months, I think we've talked about the Indo-Pacific vision that Japan has advocated, that the United States has advocated, and that other countries have advocated. But we haven't really touched upon South Korea's role in thinking about the Indo-Pacific. And some key questions that we have is, where does South Korea fit into the Indo-Pacific? Why isn't it more, proactive in terms of discussing about the Indo-Pacific vision? And third, what is some of the ways that South Korea can cooperate in the free and open Indo-Pacific? And lastly, I think importantly is, why aren't they more forthright or more proactive in this? And I think the last question is probably a really good place to start in tonight's discussion. And it has to do with what many of the countries in the Indo-Pacific face, is the challenges of balancing their biggest trading partner, China, and their security interests within the region. And that is primarily thinking about sea lanes of communication, ensuring that they're free and open and unobstructed. They're concerned about rules-based trade. And of course, they're concerned about stability within the region. So at these three levels, South Koreans arguably share most of the same interests with other key players in the Indo-Pacific, including Japan, Taiwan, Australia, Vietnam, other Southeast Asian nations, as well as countries that are situated outside the immediate Indo-Pacific region. So that is really interesting, is thinking about how South Korea is thinking about the Indo-Pacific. And just to give you some numbers, about 25.8% of total South Korean exports go to China, and that's about 132.6 billion US dollars a year, and that's a lot. And it's nearly double the amount to the United States, which is at about 14.5% of total Korean exports. So the South Korean government and economy really relies on South Korea on its economic relations with China for its prosperity, and that if it chooses a political approach on a political position on the Indo-Pacific or the quadrilateral security dialogue or other areas, that this will fundamentally probably create challenges for South Korea in terms of economics. And we've seen that back in 2017 when the South Koreans agreed to install THAAD missile technologies. So that's the terminal high altitude missile defense systems into Korea at the behest of the United States, that China punished the South Koreans through a kind of informal economic coercion, in which they prevented tourists from going to South Korea. There was some, nationalist consumerism in which Chinese decided not to buy Korean products, and many of Korea's signature, economic exports, whether it's makeup or cultural products, such as boys' bands and girls' bands, weren't allowed to visit to China, and that hurt the South Korean economy. So simply, one of the reasons why South Korea has not been so explicit about its support for any of the Indo-Pacific initiatives has to do with trade. Second, it has to do with, I think, security, in terms of thinking about what is China's leverage on North Korea, and could China potentially strengthen the North Koreans, which would, of course, create challenges for South Korea and the region. The current administration in the Blue House under Moon Jae-in, the Democratic Party, they are very much about pro-Korean Korean Peninsula engagement, and they've tried very hard to pull the countries together. And I think this is one of the reasons, again, that the South Koreans have had a challenge in terms of taking on an Indo-Pacific vision of their own and participating in the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue and some of the other initiatives within the region. Lastly, and I think when it comes to Japan and Japan's advocacy of the free and open Indo-Pacific vision, I think for the current Democratic Party in the Korean context, being very progressive in orientation and arguably quite anti-Japanese in many respects, found it difficult to associate with an initiative that was associated with former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, who, from the South Korean point of view, was seen as a nationalist, a conservative, and somebody that really didn't acknowledge the historical challenges between Korea and Japan. So these are the three reasons that I understand the South Koreans not to be very engaged into the concepts of the Indo-Pacific under a progressive party. And it has been a challenge. It has been a challenge in terms of how the United States, Japan, and South Korea, and other like-minded countries coordinate a broader Indo-Pacific strategy within the region. Now, this leads me to some of my other points with regards to South Korea and how it views the Indo-Pacific vision and some of the instruments that are being I guess, put forward by Indo-Pacific countries or countries that have Indo-Pacific strategies, like the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, AUKUS Agreement, Quad Plus cooperation. From South Korea's point of view, they look at these initiatives in the current context as being, unfortunately, seen through the lens of a containment strategy or a strategy that is meant to somehow contain China within the region. And for South Korea, this is not something that they can really attach themselves to formally because, again, of their strong economic ties with China, their dependency on the Chinese market, but also the dependency on the strong state-to-state ties between Pyongyang and Beijing, and the challenges of a progressive party in the South Korean context of buying into strategy, which is really synonymous with Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, somebody in the South Korean context that is seen as kind of an arch conservative. The challenge with these kinds of interpretations of the free and open Indo-Pacific vision or the Indo-Pacific strategy, at least from the viewpoint of associating with former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, is that Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was probably the most internationalist of prime ministers in Japan. He clearly understood that the best way to preserve Japan's security was through multilateralism and committing to the international system and buttressing the international system. And he did that through a multi-layer, multilateral process of bringing in different partners to the region that stressed a rules-based system, that stressed transparency, that stressed cooperation, that stressed international institutions. In this sense, it seems that South Korea is sitting outside a group of like-minded countries that seems to, again, see the free and open Indo-Pacific vision slightly differently, but critical to the systemic challenges associated with China's reemergence as the most important economy within this region. I mentioned the challenges between South Korea and Japan, and I think that this is really important for us to underscore when we're talking about Korea's hesitancy in terms of thinking about committing to the free and open Indo-Pacific, in that the relationships between South Korea and Japan have dramatically deteriorated since the withdrawal of the 2015 December Comfort Women Agreement between South Korea and Japan. At that time, we saw former President Park sign an agreement with the Abe administration. It was seen as an agreement that could allow the two countries to work together more seamlessly. But in retrospect, what we've seen is that the South Korean-Japan relationship became much more fraught and contested with the current president of South Korea, President Moon, coming into power. His progressive agenda and willingness to shape and change Japan-South Korean dynamics by really stepping out of the 2015 Covert Women Agreement by threatening to leave the GSOMA, the intelligence gathering agreement between the South Koreans, Japan, and the United States, and really, an elevation of the tensions between South Korea and Japan has created a challenge in terms of the two states cooperating on the free and open Indo-Pacific. Now, this is interesting in the fact that we could see how challenged a broader free and open Indo-Pacific vision will be to achieve, the difficulties it will be to achieve if South Korea isn't on board. But it also shows that there is potential for change. And with South Korea coming up to an election next month, and the prime contenders for being the president and the holder of the Blue House, Lee Jae-myung, who is a Democratic Party member and comes in the same mold as the current president, Moon Jae-in. And we have the more conservative groups led by Yoon Suk-yeol from the People's Power Party. And it's the outcome of this election that I think will determine the future of Japan-South Korea cooperation on the free and Indo-Pacific, as well as potential South Korean cooperation on initiatives such as the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue in a kind of Quad Plus formula. Lee Jae-myung from the Democratic Party is seen as someone that will continue much of the Moon administration's hardline towards Japan, focusing on Korean reunification, likely more proximate relations with China, and really creating challenges in terms of a more coherent trilateral partnership between the United States, Japan, and South Korea. Yoon Suk-yeol from the People's Power Party is seen as more pragmatic, and with an election of candidate Yoon, we could see some quid pro quos in terms of cooperation and acceptance of the free and open Indo-Pacific idea and cooperation within the Quad for elevated deterrence on the peninsula against North Korea. The conservatives have always been seen as prioritizing the broader security agenda within the region and dealing with the difficult historical issues between South Korea and Japan, more using backdoor diplomacy to deal with these difficult issues. Now, the outcome of the election is, at this particular stage, unknown. But again, I think that we can chart out, based on the division of those two parties, the direction of South Korea and its participation in the Indo-Pacific strategy or framework or vision moving forward. A progressive candidate will continue to be hesitant, and a conservative candidate will likely be more diplomatic and more nuanced in its embrace of both the free and open Indo-Pacific vision and the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue and other mechanisms of enforcing or creating a free and open Indo-Pacific vision. That leads me to maybe my last point before we open up the floor to discussion, is how do countries within the region and outside the region view South Korea's position on the free and open Indo-Pacific and its relationship within the region? And this is a challenge. I think there's a few different viewpoints. One viewpoint is that there are questions about where is South Korea? Why isn't South Korea supporting this initiative? They share the same concerns about sea lanes of communication. They share the same concerns about maintaining a rules-based order within the region where all countries follow a common set of rules and they support an international system. They wonder about South Korea's middle power identity and why it's not proactively engaged within the region to try and prevent, not just itself, but other countries being squashed between the United States and Japan, or United States and China. Others view South Korea really as the weak link to the free and open Indo-Pacific vision because of its, at this stage, its inability to create some political and security space between itself and China. Now, that may be related to who occupies the Blue House in the South Korean context, but it may also be a broader trend within the South Korean context. And South Korea has always had to manage the challenges of big states within its backyard, whether it was Japan, or whether it was the Ming Dynasty or the Qing Dynasty, or even Russia. South Korea has always had to be sensitive to power distribution within the region and trying to not get too close to one power for fear about another power within the region feeling that they were slighted or that South Korea or the Korean Peninsula was preferencing them. And that's really important. How does South Korea manage this relationship. And if you go back to the Joseon dynasty, that's the dynasty that really was in charge of South Korea for 600 years during the Ming and Qing periods of China. They were seen as Neo-Confucius. They were seen as more Confucian than the Chinese. They were seen as very sensitive to what was happening in the Ming courts. And when the Ming dynasty fell, we saw the Joseon dynasty quickly shift and form strong relations with the Qing dynasty, while at the same time maintaining an admiration for the Ming emperors, which they venerated. So I think that it's this past that really informs how South Korea is thinking about the free and open Indo-Pacific vision, joining or participating in organizations like the Quad, and how it's thinking about managing its relationships with China, Japan, and the United States when it's thinking about the free and open Indo-Pacific vision. I guess my last point, and this is quite an interesting point, as China's economy continues to develop and becomes more competitive, and it starts to develop new industries that compete directly with South Korea's signature products like the Galaxy phone or Hyundai cars, that it will be really interesting to see where South Korea positions itself between Japan, China, and the United States, as companies like Xiaomi or Huawei start to really occupy the position of Galaxy in terms of competitivity, market size, etc. This will raise some important questions for South Korea in terms of what it would like to do moving forward. Does it want to jump on the China car and benefit from that relationship, but also incur the costs of being too proximate to China? Or will it move towards the United States and Japan and build stronger relations, or will it take a third way? And I think this has implications for how South Korea thinks about the free and open Indo-Pacific in terms of finding a role as it moves forward, in terms of positioning itself between those three big states. Lastly, and I didn't mention much about North Korea in today's discussion because I think North Korea really doesn't have a role in the free and open Indo-Pacific vision and the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific, except as an instigator, except in terms of its brinkmanship to try and extract resources from surrounding states to prop up the regime. So in that sense, I don't see North Korea carving out a role. Rather, I see North Korea really being one of the instigators of countries working together to try and create more stability within the region, to push back against countries that flaunt international norms, that flaunt international law. And South Korea is one of them. Its development of weapons of mass destruction, such as nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, biological weapons, as well as attempts to proliferate those weapons. And there's well-documented evidence that North Korea reached out to the Syrian regimes, potentially reached out to Iran, and potentially reached out to non-state actors as well to get hard currency to prop up its economy. A country like North Korea really is one of the reasons why I think the free and open Indo-Pacific vision, whether it's the Japanese vision, the US vision, or others, really does focus on a rules-based order, international law, and working together with like-minded countries to ensure that not a might of is right Machiavellian approach is the final arbiter of how we engage in foreign affairs within the Indo-Pacific. Rather, rules, international law, and a shared understanding of how we should engage in international relations within the region. Maya, I'll pass it off to you.
Thank you, Stephen. Well, really concise and very clear points. I wonder, you mentioned that South Korea, the exports, 25.8% of the exports, they go to China, which is really 1/4 of the country's exports as a whole. And so, of course, this makes South Korea dependent on China and the Chinese international external policies. And I wonder whether there are any, let's say, efforts within South Korea, and well, let's say a talk in the South Korean government to diversify their exports a little bit more than now, so that they can actually become less dependent on China.
So Maya, that's a great question. And, like many other countries within the region, South Korea has joined the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and that's a partnership with the ASEAN countries, plus Japan, Korea, China, Australia, New Zealand, and we're missing India. India didn't join this agreement. So by forming a large multilateral free trade agreement, what happens is that you start to open up your economy to other markets so that you can slightly recalibrate your trade portfolio with China. South Korea is also investing in, or it's considering joining the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership as well. Again, this is another way to diversify its trading footprint so that it's less dependent on the Chinese economy. But I think there's some realities. The reality is that South Korea is capital rich, and still today China is resource rich, and the cost of labor is relatively low compared to South Korea. So it's a natural complementary relationship. Second, geographically, they're pretty much next door, so that means that South Korea can benefit from that market immediately. And third, again, they have a strong relationship that dates back for many, many decades, if not hundreds of years, in terms of their trade and cultural relationship that kind of makes them a natural partner. And the contrast is Japan. And, we know the unfortunate history between South Korea or for the Korean Peninsula and Japan. Of course, Japan annexed the Korean Peninsula. They had some pretty harsh cultural policies. We know the history behind the comfort women issue. I don't want to rehash this terribly sad history, but that history has created a barrier in terms of more open and dynamic trade relations with Japan. And just let me give you a number, and it's really, really interesting because I think trade says a lot. Trade with Japan is about $25.1 billion in terms of exports, so about 4.9% of the trade. Taiwan, a political entity that is, probably 1/6 the size of Japan, is 16.5 billion or 3.2% of trade. And that says really a lot about the kind of how history can affect trade, how history can affect trade relations. And I think that this is something to really, really reflect upon in terms of if we want to produce better cooperation between Japan and South Korea, is most likely we're going to have to deal with historical issues on both sides of the Japan Sea to start to create a more complementary and synergistic relationship. It's very, very interesting, and I just don't know if that's possible. But again, South Korea is in a process of diversifying, but the diversification process will take generations, not just 5 years or 2 years.
Yes, it takes time, and as you said, it's historical reasons. I believe that for anybody who has lived here in the region, or probably in Japan or South Korea, for a certain number of years, it's clear that these historical reasons are difficult to resolve at this point of time, and maybe it's going to be difficult for quite some time from now on too.
Well, it's true, but I think that in the South Korean context, there's a little bit more flexibility because, again, the stark contrast between progressives and conservatives in terms of their approach and how they deal with diplomacy with Japan and how they deal with diplomacy towards the United States. So I do think there's more flexibility on the South Korean side. On the Japanese side, as we know, the LDP has been in power for decades, except for small periods of time. And there's much more consistency in how they engage in foreign policy towards the region and towards South Korea. So I think that probably South Korea has more political space to do more because they have more dramatic changes in power when an election happens.
I can see your point. Yes, Federico.
Yeah,
Hello.
morning, evening. It's morning here in Argentina. Yeah, well, thanks a lot, Dr. Nagy, for your concise view on the topic. My question, I'm going to blame Maya for this because it's going to be a compound question, is regarding the US elections and the possible consequence of it, because depends on the polls you are reading. It's possible that the Biden administration is going to lose some seats in the lower house, right?
Yes.
And he's going to have to focus more inwards the country and stop focusing on the Pacific and on the Atlantic. So the real question is, do you think that in the hypothetical case this happened, maybe Japan or Korea could step up their game as to counter China, or maybe it would be Australia or India that are already part of the Quad Alliance? Thanks.
Thanks, Federico. So those are really good questions. So first of all, I think when we're looking at the upcoming elections, midterm elections in the United States in 2022, a couple of things that we should take a look at. That the Senate and the House of Representatives both are up for play. Traditionally, the ruling party always loses seats, so that I don't think that it's a surprise that the Biden administration will lose seats in the House of Representatives. And the question is how much. And which seats are they going to lose, right? So if they lose some extreme progressive seats, that may not have the same impact as if they lose centrist seats. And on the Republican side, is it the more forever Trump people that win seats, or is it other individuals? So I think that it's really too early to say, how this will affect the free and open Indo-Pacific vision. On the Senate, this has dramatic effects in terms of how law is passed and how the Biden administration can engage moving forward. But traditionally, it's the first 2 years in a U.S. presidency where a consequential policy happens. Once the power balance within the House of Representatives and the Senate changes out of favor of the president or the party in power, that president starts to focus on legacy items in the foreign policy domain, because that's where they have more latitude. So this is interesting, and we saw this under the former Trump administration, that the House of Representatives did flip to the Democrats. We saw it more difficult for him to do things domestically, and he became more proactive internationally. I would characterize that proactivity as both positive and negative, but that was an area that he had more political space to push forward. So I think that post midterm elections, we will see a Biden administration that doesn't have the same latitude for domestic policy change. But I think at the international level, there's too much cohesiveness on dealing with China and trying to have a coherent Indo-Pacific vision for the region to significantly step back. But I think that our Japanese friends and our South Korean friends are watching, and not just those two countries, our Australian friends, Singapore, others, are watching very carefully what happens in Washington as we lead up to the 2022 elections. They're concerned about 2024, potential return of President Trump or a President Trump-like figure. They understand what it meant for the region and for engagement within the region, for alliances, for transactional diplomacy, for trade agreements. So in a sense that I think that we're likely to see the Japanese and the South Koreans and other interested parties step up to the plate, try to fill the gap in a couple ways. One is to create opportunities for the United States to lead and to look good and to make the leader look good. So that may mean concessions on trade. It may mean tabling some kind of Indo-Pacific economic framework that the Biden administration can get buy-in. It may mean increasing defense and military budgets. It may mean more cooperation in the quadrilateral security dialogue or other arguments or other institutions. So I think that our Korean friends and our Japanese friends and Australian friends are very, very, very sensitive to these issues. And I think that they will definitely step up to the plate on those areas. We should also expect all of them to increase their investment in the United States and help with not only spearheading infrastructure and connectivity projects with U.S. leadership within this region, but even potentially helping build infrastructure connectivity projects back home in the United States to, again, help the current leader succeed in his agenda of spearheading a sustainable, comprehensive, and effective Indo-Pacific strategy. So it's a bit counterintuitive. We would think that success may make it more difficult for the United States, but if there is a big change domestically in the House of Representatives and the Senate, we will see a more proactive Japan, South Korea, Australia, and others, because they really want to anchor the United States within the region. They want the United States leaders to be successful, and they understand the best way to do that is investing in the relationship, investing in the United States domestically, and demonstrating that they are not free riders. What do you think, Federico?
Well, awesome. I have taken down so many notes. Yeah, well, thanks a lot for the answer. I pass the question to Mark.
Okay, thank you.
Mark, hello.
Hello. Thanks for the room and very interesting topic regarding Korea. Because I don't usually think of the two Koreas as being important with the Indo-Pacific, but maybe except for what Stephen said regarding the ties with Japan and the U.S. I just want to point out that the Jisomia controversy, that was, I think, I remember writing something about this. I think it's a casualty from the trade dispute in 2019. I'm not sure if many people still remember that.
I think it was, it was definitely a casualty from the Japan putting the South Koreans on what's called the white list,
Yeah,
where they restricted certain kinds of materials and products from being used preferentially by South Korean businesses. And yeah, that's how I understand the the issue from the starting.
right. I guess there's one more thing I need to point out. Also, the POSCO venture. I remember that was also controversial because, as you said, they seized the assets of Mitsubishi through the joint venture,
Yes.
so that they can pay the comfort women, at least those who are still surviving.
So these are also areas where it creates a challenge in terms of the Japanese finding ways to cooperate with the South Koreans, at least until they move to a different position. I'm not agreeing or disagreeing with the Japanese position. Rather, I'm stating how I understand their position. There's a real sense in Tokyo that every time they come to an agreement with the South Koreans, that they have a short-term lull in relations. Things move in a better, positive direction, and then another leader comes into power, or something domestically happens in the Korean context, and as a result, somebody says that Japan needs to be more. They need to apologize more. That these issues have not been dealt with transparently. And from the Japanese side, this is seen as really inconsistent with how international negotiations work, and you can't continue to demand more and more and more when you've agreed to settle this issue, not once, not twice, not three times. Again, there's a lot of fatigue in the Japanese context, but still, certain parts of South Korean society feel that this issue has not been addressed sufficiently. As a third-party Canadian, I sit in a very difficult position because I see the human drama that has happened here, the human tragedy of the comfort women issue. But as a scholar, I also know that this issue is not just so black and white in terms of who was the perpetrator, who was the victim, and what is an actual apology. And it's really troublesome because both Japan and Korea are places where I have great friends and great respect and admiration for, and it's really unfortunate that they haven't been able to put this behind them.
Right. I guess one thing I'm going to keep an eye on is because South Korea is considering whether to join the CPTPP.
Yep.
And yeah, I think President Moon said it in his New Year's speech last year.
Yes.
So that's interesting to see.
So I expect that South Korea will. The CPTP negotiations, they are very difficult, and the first country to jump on board of the CPTP negotiations was the UK, and following the UK, China, then Taiwan, and then South Korea, released statements that they wanted to join this trade agreement. Now, the Japanese and other countries are determined to make the UK really, abide by the standards with no exceptions. And I think the take-home message is they want to make sure that there's no room for another country to come in and demand changes to the CTPP for their accession. And by being hard on the UK, the Japanese and others are probably sending the message that it's probably pretty unlikely that China will be able to join if the UK has to go through all these loops. South Korea, I think, has a lot of potential to join because of its development of its economy, its economic system, and has strong rule of law. I think that there's a real potential for South Korea, but the first steps are going to be UK, somehow rejecting China. I don't know how they're going to deal with Taiwan because I know some countries that are negotiating for the CTPP are very much in favor of Taiwan, and then bring in South Korea's case. So I think South Korea is a few years ahead, but it's always good for them to negotiate and think about how to use the CPTP as a way to diversify from China, but also strengthen their position and their economic relations with countries like Japan and Canada, Mexico, Australia, New Zealand, and other CPTP members.
Yeah, that's going to be very interesting if the application goes through.
I think we're a ways away, to be frank, but the application will be considered,
Hmm.
but it's in the queue.
Right. That's good to hear. Thanks.
You're welcome, Mark. Good to hear from you.
Stephen, you mentioned also that the trade with Taiwan is what 16 billion or over
Yeah.
16 billion US dollars, which is not a small amount for Taiwan. So I wonder how Taiwan sees South Korea and its stance on the free and open Indo-Pacific. If you can give us some insights on that too, I believe that.
So Maya, that's a great question. I think that Taiwan would like to see a South Korea that has a much more autonomous policy towards the region. And an autonomous policy towards the region means a more proactive and, I guess, explicit support for the free and open Indo-Pacific vision, for Taiwan, application for the CPTPP, for, participating in the Quad in some format. But the problem is that, again, South Korea's economy, 25.6%, is tied to its relationship with China. And that makes it very, very difficult for the South Koreans to have a strong position on Taiwan, to advocate for Taiwan's position. So it's a challenge, and this is despite fairly strong trade relations between South Korea and the political entity of Taiwan. And you've probably noticed that I keep saying the political entity of Taiwan as opposed to the country of Taiwan or some other issue or some other articulation. But I think I'm trying to be relatively honest about and neutral on this position. So I think Taiwan, again, would love to see more cooperation between the United States, South Korea, and Japan. They'd like to see a more proactive South Korea that's advocating for much of the issues that, modern South Korea has been known for. Its vibrant civil society, its defense of human rights, its defense for democracy and rule of law. And, modern South Korea, after 1988, after the Seoul Olympics, became a democracy, right?
Yes.
And, from Taiwan's perspective, it's a bit, hypocritical, or they see it as hypocritical that the very foundation of that modern Korea was founded on is not really being espoused in the broader region through supporting things like the free and open Indo-Pacific.
Yes, at the same time, we could say, well, not exactly the same, but similar things about other countries in the region as well. So,
Absolutely.
Yes. So, yeah, it's not just South Korea that has challenges in terms of adhering to democratic values in its external policy.
Absolutely.
Comment via the back channel now, so I'll read it out to you. Some people have issues trusting South Korea. Yes.
Yes, and as I mentioned, I think that there is real apology fatigue in the Japanese context about South Korea's position on everything from comfort women issues to history to war reparations. But I need to be intellectually honest. I think that for the South Korean perspective or the Chinese perspective, when they see leaders visit Yasukuni Shrine and pay homage to the war dead, which includes war criminals, they also, and I realize it's not all politicians and definitely not all Japanese, but they also see inconsistencies. So there's inconsistencies on both sides, and there seems to be selective historical amnesia on both sides about what's happened in the past, as public memories of wartime past between Japan and South Korea, or Japan and Korea, or Japan and China have been oversimplified and I think manipulated by the state for political purposes. So I do think there's a lot of challenges that can be shared around the table. But again, that's a Canadian speaking. I'm not speaking as a Japanese or a Korean or a Chinese.
Yeah, I can see that. And me being neither Japanese nor Chinese or even Korean, I sometimes wonder, because you mentioned the Japanese politicians paying visits to the Yasukuni Shrine and all let's say, the Japanese soldiers who have died in wars, and also, well, they include obviously some of them, the souls, let's say, of the war criminals. And I wonder, because to me, it looks like lack of communication, lack of explanation, and more or less a cultural issue on the Japanese side, because well, in Shinto, you cannot, once the souls of the dead people are what's that, included into that collective body of souls in a shrine. So it's basically impossible to get them back or to separate them. So that's what I have heard from people who talk about this, and who are well versed in historical issues and Shinto teachings and studying. So, but this is me, what I have heard after living 20 years in Japan, and I haven't seen much about this, any information about this put out there, so that it is explained, and so that some people can actually realize why those war criminals are still there.
Well, I agree with you, and today's discussion is not so much about Yasukuni Shrine and
Oh no, it isn't. Sorry.
About the internment of Class A war criminals. But I think that it's an important part of this discussion in terms of understanding why there's not more buy-in from the South Koreans about the free and open Indo-Pacific that was advocated by Japan. And for many in Seoul or South Korea broadly, there's this mistrust that is, now it's intergenerational mistrust about Japan and not being honest about its history. And that is partly fueled by some, I think, real issues with inconsistencies about discussing history, but it's also fueled by, I think, misinformation about Japanese society and how Japan as a country has really lots of different views about its wartime past, the comfort women issue, and many aspects of Japan's imperial period.
Yeah, it's definitely a complex and multi-layered issue, and there is a lot to be done for it to be solved. But obviously, as you say, the mistrust, the mutual mistrust is a huge barrier to the solution. So, Tomoko, hello.
Yes, I have a question. Before that, actually, I've seen the shrine stating that they managed to separate somebody's soul from the original shrine. So whatever some people explaining that they can't divide, that's not true, because I've seen in Hiroshima happened. So, but that's a different story, and I'm not really going into that issue. My question is nothing related to about Korean or any particular countries, but my question actually I mentioned in LinkedIn. I'm wondering about the strategy about AI, because China obviously taking this strong position about AI strategy on how to use it. Whereas in America or Western society or I don't know, Indo-Pacific areas or whatever, I don't think there is any organizations trying to have the coherent or one particular strategy how we can actually use AI, because already although we've been seeing some physical combat on the soil, like in Ukraine, but generally speaking, the war is not only on the soil but also in the cyber area. And AI is one of the important tool to think about, because already people are discussing about ethics in military use, ethics in AI or military use. So I'm wondering about, are there any specific or coherent discussion going on about America, how America government or NATO or Indo-Pacific organization, the Quad or whatever, trying to have the agreed strategy on AI?
Thanks, Tomoko. This is a really, really important question, and I want to try and couch this in today's theme about South Korea and the Koreas and the Indo-Pacific, but also I think put this in the broader context of some of the institutions that are emerging in the Indo-Pacific region that are going to deal with some of these challenges. So you're correct. AI is really has become central to how we think about innovation, how we think about governance, how we think about many aspects of how our societies are going to move forward. There's a great book called AI Superpower by Lee Kai-fong that I recommend you read, as well as a book by Henry Kissinger and Eric Schmidt called The Age of AI. And both books talk about the revolutionary impact that AI will have on all aspects of our life, including our decision making, how we're governed, our likes, our communities that we make and build. And they're very, very interesting. And both books, in different ways, talk about the two systems that are competing with each other. One, I think, led by China, which is more of a closed system that has a strong government footprint, where the government can use your information for various purposes and to develop AI further. And this has both positive and negative aspects. And the other model is the US-based model, which really allows corporations to explore our data to make money for those corporations. In both systems, we are data poor, in that we are just tools for those systems to either conduct control or to create profit. So there is a lot of work being written out there to try and develop new standards to try and deal with some of these challenges. At the COP 2000 G7 or G20 in Osaka, former Prime Minister Abe released something called the Data Free Flow with Trust Initiative, which was meant to deal with some of these challenges. And as with many things that come out of Japan, some countries love it. And of course, I think South Korea and China had very strong suspicions about Japan's motivations. The mini trade deal between Japan and the United States in the fall of 2020 also had some digital components to deal with the digital economy and AI. And the most recent initiative is the AUKUS, the Australia, UK, and the United States cooperation at two levels, in terms of deterrence capabilities, in terms of the acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines, and two, they have basically firewalled cooperation in the areas of AI, quantum computing, hypersonic missiles, and cybersecurity, with the understanding that these are critical areas of convergence and competition that will shape not only the Indo-Pacific region, but the world's economy, how we govern, the relationship between governments and people, how we create ideas. So the Data Free Flow with Trust Initiative, the free trade agreement that I mentioned between Japan and the United States, the comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership that has a digital component, as well as this AUKUS agreement, are all different ways to try and write some rules of the road for how AI develops moving forward. But frankly, at this stage, I think it's too early to know. We don't know the direction of this cooperation. I think most observers say that China is immensely data rich and moving very, very quickly in terms of its AI development because of its the amount of data it has. And just to put it in context for you, if the average Chinese citizen uses WeChat and they do 10 engagements on their WeChat system a day, that would means they have 14 billion data points a day, times 365 a year, in terms of data points to refine their AI systems. Japan obviously doesn't have that much. Either does the United States or other Western countries. So China is moving very quickly because of it's so data rich, and its legal system allows for the government to be involved. So that leads us to the question is, what does this mean for where's South Korea, where's Japan, where's the cooperation within the region? Frankly, there's not enough. Japan and South Korea both are talking about data privacy, but not multilateralization of shared norms and values in terms of AI development. And I think this has to do with, as much as partly because both countries, despite their reputations as being high-tech, are not as high-tech in these areas as I think China is. But two, I think they just don't know how to cooperate internationally on these two areas. And this will have profound implications to how the Indo-Pacific develops moving forward, depending if they can form a kind of cooperative mechanism so that many countries can engage in some kind of cooperation in the areas of AI.
Thank you very much. I've been reading a book by Amy Webb called Big Now. Then the discussion she made was actually what you made. And actually the discussion you made was something I've been discussing with my friend a long time ago before Amy Webb wrote the book. And still the issue of the trust, I think that the issue here in Western society in general is the trust among the concerned party, because I discussed with the person from EU about data privacy issue. And even EU, there seems to be a big problem of the trust between the government and the end users. And also, we don't trust Google's, for instance, or we don't trust Mr. Masayoshi because of the certain reasons. So, whereas in in China, they don't need to trust government, for instance, because it's a rule. There's already regulations, and they've got huge amount of data without making any thinking about the privacy issue. So that but at the same time, we need to think about how we handle the AI issue, because otherwise, are we really putting the profit-minded companies to pursue in this area without having any basic rules? Because that sounds also very scary, as well as probably we might be very behind compared with China. That's my comment. Sorry, I'm done speaking.
Thank you, Tomoko. I have lots to add on this, but just out of consideration for the other people in the room, I'll be succinct. I think Europe is trying to find a middle path between, the data poverty they experience in the United States and in the Western kind of internet world, and the data poverty that I think Chinese citizens experience in the authoritarian data poor world. And that is through regulation and trying to ensure that we as consumers or users of the internet and these systems have some ownership over our data. Whether that be successful, I think will fundamentally depend on if they can get US buy-in and corporate buy-in. And what we tend to see is that more and more citizens in Western countries are starting to realize how data poor they actually are, and how this is creating challenges in society in terms of what we see on our LinkedIn or Facebook, Twitter profiles, and that they want to have more autonomy about what they see rather than algorithms being used to shape our worldviews and our communities and how we engage in the world.
These are issues which still need to be resolved again. Well, we live in a time when a lot of governments are trying to collect as much data as possible, as Stephen noted. But China definitely has an advantage in this sense of the word. So, James, hello.
Oh, hello. Hi.
Hi.
Hi, James.
Hi. Thanks for having me on. Can I speak? Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah.
Appreciate me having me on. I was delighted to see this topic, and so I immediately hopped in. And I'm not sure how much I've missed, but I thought I might be in a good position to maybe perhaps talk about give more better idea about the general sentiment or the landscape of sentiment in Korea. Regarding whatever issues, perhaps regarding what I heard about the Taiwan issue. I think what's not being covered enough in the international media. I'm not very sure, but in my observation, it's not there's some misunderstanding in the international community. But one thing that might help understand what the Korean sentiment is that Koreans love the Japanese people, of course, but it's the kind of democracy that's the difference between what's going on in Korea and in Japan, and a lot of the predominant sentiment in Korea is that they take issue with the fact that the Liberal Democratic Party is in power for almost permanently, and
7 decades.
yeah, and that's exactly the issue in Korea. The whole democracy process in Korea was about overturning the power that had been should I say collaborated with the Japanese rulers, which is the Conservative Party in Korea. And there's an election right about in 2 weeks' time in Korea. Right now on TV, there's a live debate going on. And it's really difficult to overturn that because a lot of the corporate power is connected with that with that political sector, so political force. So changing laws and the public influencing the civil society, influencing the bureaucratic system, that's also been very much tied with that specific political force. That's the whole story of Korean democracy. And we don't, a lot of Koreans think that it's not happening in Japan. If that happens, it's okay. We would love to, we would trust any government that is liberal. And in that sense, there's a delicacy in diplomacy, and it might seem on the surface that Korea is not supporting Taiwan, but hey, like in Myanmar case, Korean people were almost furious. They were very angry. The government's not doing anything about it, and it was easier to do that because the ties with in Myanmar case, the ties with China was not an obvious issue, so it kind of gave an excuse to do something. But Korea couldn't do anything by itself. They had to go through UN, where it's not easy to take action. The U.S. couldn't take action either. So, I mean, I'm talking about the general sentiment in Korea, and so when it comes down to a critical point, Korea will definitely be on the side of the liberal democratic values. So we'll take side with Japan or whoever with defending Taiwan. But having said that, everybody knows we're not in a position to be, what's the saying? We're not even in control of our peninsula, and it's hard for us to, go beyond our usual power to talk about other countries' security. We're wanting to at least normalize ties, at least to be able to declare end of war with North Korea, but it's not happening. And the reason is, the reason is in the public mind is that it's the Conservative Party in Korea that is very much connected somehow with the Japanese Liberal Democratic Party and the right wing, and who are also in connection with perhaps the conservative side of the U.S. politics. So, so we're not in position to say, hey, we want peace in Taiwan. I mean, we are like Taiwan right now when it comes to North Korea issues. So yeah, that might that dimension I thought might help in the debate, in the issue, in the conversation. Yeah, thanks for that.
Thanks, James. That's really, I think those are some really insightful comments. And every time I've been to South Korea, one of the, I guess, the impressions I have is how vibrant the civil society is. And I remember walking through downtown Seoul many times, and I can't remember how many protests and demonstrations I experienced in the same day and the same street. It is so vibrant, and the Koreans have a culture of I don't like to use the word rebelling, but speaking out against injustice that they feel that's in their society, but also in other societies. So it's something that I really I find fascinating, but also really inspirational there. And your comment about the connection between conservative politics, I think there bears a lot of truth there. The former president of South Korea, President Park Geun-hye, who signed the Comfort Women Agreement with the Japanese. Her father, of course, was an officer in the Japanese military and spoke fluent, if not native, Japanese during the imperial period. And he worked very closely with the Japanese government in signing the 1965 normalization agreement, and made a specific, statement that, he didn't want reparations for and apologies. He just wanted the aid to help South Korea develop. So I can see your point and why there is skepticism about the LDP today, especially as some of their top leaders really, it seems to have very, very strong historical ties to the Japanese political class pre-World War II and during World War II and post-World War II. So I think that your comments really have a lot to say. Someone that's lived in the region for a long time, one thing that I do notice about the LDP is the consistency in some of its conservative views, as well as its ability to change to address the changing nature of Japanese society. I don't think it's changed probably in the direction that South Korea would like, but I do think it's I wouldn't put it in the category of a militaristic society or a party that's advocating militarism. I wouldn't put it in the category of a party that is anti-Korea. And I think that it really is committed to multilateralism and international institutions. And it has a more selective view about human rights abroad, just like South Korea and other countries.
Sure, I think that's a very fair about the LDP in Japan. I'm sure there are sufficient reasons they can stay in power. It's just that when we say certain connections, I think that might be an arguable term. Maybe I would say, just like you said, there are definitely parallels in the policies, the direction of policies. There are a lot of parallels between the Korean Conservative Party and the LDP and the U.S. Conservative. I wouldn't say the whole Republican Party, but a certain faction of the hawkish side of their militaristic side. So I think there's when we debate, when the conservative supporters would say, hey, what's the connection you're talking about? What's the evidence? But there's definitely a lot of parallels in the policies, especially regarding on North Korea. When North Korea does something, does a missile test, it always goes through the media as if they're doing something very threatening, and they're just doing a test to develop their machines, their
Missiles.
Yeah. So which any country does, and they can't shoot westwards, which is land, and they can't shoot southward, which is also land. They're just shooting eastward just because it's the ocean. And I think and Japan sometimes takes that as a threat, shooting at them, but it's just because they don't have any other water to shoot at. So I think there's a lot of misunderstanding to talk about. Yeah.
Thanks very much, James. Again, I think those are some really interesting comments, and maybe it's a discussion that we could have moving forward if we pivot towards a different kind of broader theme about the relationships between different conservative parties globally. Right. Well, just again, thank you very much, everybody, for joining today. I'm so happy to hear from people like Mark and James and Tomoko and Federico. Again, this is a dialogue, and we're here to share different views and to learn from each other. And, I say a few things as somebody that watches these issues quite, seriously, to set the table. But ultimately, what's served on the menu is because of the interaction of everybody. So thanks very much. Thanks to Maya for her spearheading this initiative on Japan Experts Insights. And I look forward to talking to everybody in a couple weeks about our next theme.
Thank you, Stephen. This was Japan Expert Insights on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Thank you for coming and staying with us today. We will be on air in 2 weeks on Monday at 8:30 p.m. Japan time again, so join us. Until then, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload all the episodes on Japanese politics, business insights, and the role of Japan in the Indo-Pacific region. If you want to stay informed about our upcoming events, you can follow us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Again, we are looking forward to your joining us next week. Until then, stay well and make every day count. See you.